redemptive suffering is such a huge topic. I literally did a few years ago, I did like a 5-week course on it and took like 2 hours. So I did like a 10-hour course on it. So I mean, and then that's just like scratching the surface. So I was trying to think like, how could I present this? And then also not only how can I present such a big topic, but then also to meet what y'all are doing, right? So this is what I came up with. I'm just showing you my sources right now. I used John Paul's letter on the Christian meaning of human suffering, and then a book called The Problem of Pain, which was written by C.S. Lewis. And so as we go through, that's where all this information is really coming from. But I decided that I would look at redemptive suffering from basically 4 aspects. So suffering as curse, suffering as punishment or discipline, suffering as salvific, and suffering as redemptive. And so, like I said, we'll eventually get to redemptive suffering, but I think all of it together will make sense once we get to the redemptive suffering part. So suffering as a curse, I think that actually John Paul says this, it's not me, this is not my thoughts at all. John Paul says in his letter that everybody suffers, we all suffer to differing degrees, physical suffering, moral suffering, right? And he says that not only are there different kinds of suffering, for instance, if we're talking about physical pain, that's one way of suffering, but then we can also have moral pain, right? Where we're suffering like the consequences of our sins. And then we can have spiritual suffering, right? And he says that the reason that in humans suffering is a multifaceted experience is because we are body-soul integrations, right? We are composed in our very being of both matter and spirit. And he says that all of us who are composed in this way, all human persons, even if we come from different walks of life, different religions, right, etc., we all are united together in this common human experience of suffering. And not only in the experience of suffering, but what really unites us is that we ask the question, why? And that when we ask the question why, oftentimes our pain even becomes greater because we are able to reflect or ask the question, why? Why is this happening? Why am I hurting in this way? Why is my child doing that, right? Etc. So the question of why is at the heart, I think, of our experience of suffering. And so I wanted to start there. So we're going to do a little anthropology, not only because I love it so much, but I think it really lends itself to helping us understand ourselves and understand this mystery of suffering a little better. And so I'm going to read this brief passage from Genesis after the fall, right? This is when God shows up in the story, and the original sin has already happened, and he shows up and he has already kind of gone through the questioning, why did you do that? And they've all pointed the finger at the other, and this is where he's sort of doling out the consequences, right? He's like, okay, because you've done this, here's what's going to happen. And so to the woman, he said, I will intensify your toil in childbearing. In pain, you shall bring forth children. Yet your urge shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. To the man he said, because you listened to your wife and ate from the tree about which I commanded you, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you shall eat its yield all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bear for you, and you shall eat the grass of the field. By the sweat of your brow you shall eat bread until you return to the ground from which you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Now, some interesting things about the way that this expresses the consequences of their choice, Adam and Eve's choice. first of all, we see an interesting anthropological fact, right? Notice how God is doling out the consequences according to their masculinity and femininity, right? That's the first thing. So it's hitting the core root of the person, right? There's something that is now changing in the very essence of the person. Both the female in her pain and childbearing and the male in his more expressive, like exterior work that he does, right? So this change that happened because as a consequence of this sin, right? We call in the church concupiscence. And so I looked up the definition of concupiscence in the catechism, and paragraph 2515 talks about it as any intense form of human desire. And I think that's a really good place to start, right? So the word itself means like intense desire. Now not all desire is bad. Not all intense desire is bad, right? There's a particular kind of intense desire for that is concupiscent. And so theology has borrowed this word concupiscence and given it a particular meaning. And this is how it's phrased whenever we talk about it as a consequence of the fall. It's a movement of the sensitive appetite contrary to human reason. And I remember before I would look at the anthropology of the human person, I remember I would read, like if I read this, because I've been teaching a long time, you know. And so I would be like, what does that even mean? Like, does anybody know? Does anybody really know what that means? All right. And so I thought I'd show us what that actually means. And I think it'll be helpful to understand how deeply touched and uprooted each individual human person has been by the fall, by concupiscence. Because this is where suffering entered the world, was through the original sin. And it's the whole reason why we're even subject to it now, right? So you'll have to, this is an analogy, this drawing, you see it repeated twice, that's not a glitch. I have it on here twice just to demonstrate, if you've noticed, one is before the fall, one is after the fall. And so to understand how deeply humans are wounded by concupiscence and the suffering that it causes us, we have to understand what we were made to be first, right? And so what we're made to be first, we can find that identity in original man, how God made us before we sinned. And this is from St. Thomas Aquinas, this understanding of the human soul, the human person. And we can't really draw a soul, but if we could, this is an analogy, a weak one too, by the way. But the circle represents the human soul, but we know that this soul is composite, right? That we are spiritual souls and material souls, meaning that we are matter and spirit. And we have operations that are run, so to speak, by our soul in both of those realities, material and spirit. And I'll show you what I mean. So we share some things in common with lower kinds of life forms. For instance, on the level of all that exists, this is that lowest level in the circle, level of all being. Being there means all of existence, everything that exists, especially living things. Everything that exists, us, plants, animals, right? Everything that exists, especially living things, have the tendency, or what we call the inclination in our very nature, in our very essence, to keep existing, right? So self-preservation, continuing to live, right? This is common with everything that exists, especially all living things. So we share this in common, right? This is a power or an inclination of our nature. And then we have the level of what's called all sensible being. Now, when we hear the word sensible, we think, oh, like that makes sense, right? Like it's coherent. That's not what this means at all. All sensible being means anything that has senses, any living thing that has senses. So animals, right? Touch, taste, etc. So anything that has senses we share with them an inclination in our nature to the procreation and education of offspring, right? This is even why God made us male and female, right? Because what was the command that he gave us? Be fruitful and multiply, right? So by our very nature, by our very human nature, right? We have this natural tendency as a species, right? As a nature to go toward continuing the species, right? We share this in common with animals. But we have something that both plants and animals do not have. And but angels have it. So that's kind of cool to think about. Unfortunately, not enough time in this talk, but cool to think about. We have the level of rational being. We are rational creatures. We have what's called a rational soul. And so this level of our rational being, right? It has some natural inclinations as well, or some natural tendencies or tendencies that we have by our nature. One of them is to know truth. That's our intellect, right? So our intellect gives us the power to know truth, but also like propels us toward truth, right? So we want to know truth as human persons, especially we want to know the truth about God, because, right, God is truth. Jesus said, I'm the way, the life, the way, the truth, and the life, right? So God himself defined himself as truth. And so we are drawn, right, by our intellect to know truth, especially to know God. And then we also have this natural tendency in our nature to live in society. Another way to say this could be not only to live in society, but to love others, right? So if you think about it, it makes perfect sense with the gospel to be made in this way, because our living in society or our loving others in society is our free will. Love comes from the will, right? To love is to will the good of the other, right? So to be made in this way is very much the Christian vision of the human person, because Jesus even said, right, I give you a new commandment, love one another as I have loved you, right? He gave us the two great commandments, love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and your neighbor as yourself, right? So these fit right into the gospel vision of the person. And what is supposed to happen in the human person is that this level of rational being, I have it looks like levels of my analogy, but really our soul is not like different things, right? We just have one soul. So it's not really divided up like that. However, so what happens is this level of rational being is supposed to like permeate down into these lower inclinations that we have, kind of like in our material, right? So my spiritual part of me is supposed to like be governing all those lower parts of me, right? And in response, before sin, these lower inclinations in me were like, yeah, I'm on team rational, right? They're like, yeah, I'm gonna do everything I can. I'm so happy to submit to the rational in me, and not to like do anything, that's outside my nature. And so because the human person worked this way, a happy submission of those lower natural inclinations to our highest natural inclinations. What happened before sin was that the whole person, so our lives, our desires, all of our sensate desires, they were all directed to our highest, our rational inclinations to know truth, particularly truth about God, and to love others in society. This is how we were made, right? But then we chose something different. And as a consequence of that choice, something occurred in our very makeup, in our very constitution as a human person. So this rational part of me that was supposed to have this perfect governance over all these lower things going on in me, that was broken, right? And as a result, things kind of went haywire, right? Everything that is lower in me now, the way John Paul puts it, is it works against what is rational in me. It actually works against my greatest goods, to know the truth about God and to love others in society. So what's happening, instead of me being directed, you notice in the first picture before the fall, the whole person is directed outside of himself, right? Everything's in order and is wholly directed to God primarily, right? But if you notice in the second picture, where that arrow is pointing, it's pointing back to the self, particularly the lower part of the self, sensible being, right? So because my governance of myself is now a state of concupiscence, right? Rather than a state of innocence, now all of my lower inclinations, all of my sense inclinations work against what is reasonable in me. And it works against me making a gift of myself to God, me seeking him first and primary. Now I'm directed to myself, to selfishness, right? I'm, in a sense, the human person has imploded on himself, right? As a result of concupiscence, this is the experience. I fold in on myself, right? And this causes horrible suffering. But what I think we don't understand when we think about suffering in this way is that it's a very real suffering. We are literally, in our very being, we are wounded. We have been wounded. And we don't inherit like Adam and Eve's personal consequences of their sin. I mean, personal like guilt of their sin, but we inherited all those consequences. And sometimes this idea of the movement of the sensitive appetite, right? We have to like, if we want to put that into like, what does that mean? It means this, it means the second picture. It means that these lower inclinations are moving against my highest inclinations and therefore directing me to myself. Okay, and you'll notice that the way it does this is it unsettles man's moral faculties. What does that mean? Faculties are powers that the person has or the soul has, right? So what happens is I don't know who I am anymore in the fullness of how I was created to be, right? And so because of that, I'm not sure how I'm supposed to act, right? I'm not sure if choosing what's truthful and choosing what's loving and good, I don't have the like assurance within myself anymore that that's going to bring me happiness. You see, now I doubt, right? I doubt God's goodness. I doubt his plan. I doubt that I'm made to know him, right? So all of this doubt enters in, and it's unsettling to our ability to live as his disciples, to live for Christ. So concupiscence is in itself not a sin, but we see how it has wrecked the human person, and how the human person is constitutionally like made up to function, made up to relate to God and to others. And sometimes when you study this part, right, this idea of suffering in this way, I find that sometimes it can be a little flat. Like, you know, we have all these words and we're trying to explain it, but it's hard to like really put forth what was the experience, right? C.S. Lewis does this. He taught in his chapter on the fall in his book, The Problem of Pain. I have these two quotes, and I think what he does here, everything we just said, right, is doctrine, right? What Lewis does is he puts the flesh of experience on that doctrine. And so this is what he says about the consequences of the fall, what we call concupiscence. He says, it was the emergence of a new kind of man, a new species, never made by God, had sinned itself into existence. Right? A new species never made by God had sinned itself into existence. Right? In other words, right, we were never supposed to be sinners. And we were never supposed to have these effects of sin and one of the major ones is suffering, right? So we kind of, as humans, we did that to ourselves, right? We wounded. we are suffering from a self wound, right? And then Lewis also says it was a radical alteration of man's constitution, a disturbance of the relation of his component parts, right? And so this is the suffering, or this is the reason, right? Because we always want to say why. There's maybe not even any personal guilt attached to why we suffer sometimes, which we're going to get into in just a moment. But as a human race, as a human family, this is why, right? Because we sinned, that's why suffering exists. That's why it entered the world. Okay, the second point I want to make is looking at suffering as a punishment or discipline. And in his letter on redemptive suffering, John Paul says this is not always a bad thing, like suffering as punishment or discipline. I'll never forget, I have a story about punishment, because we misunderstand sometimes what punishment is. Punishment is not revenge, right? Our whole justice system is kind of set up on the revenge model. You do eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, you do this is your consequence, you owe this, because that's a very legalistic way of looking at. I'm not saying it's not necessary, but I'm saying that it's a very one-dimensional way to look at punishment. I remember a story. I have a story about punishment. My mom, my nephew, who is now 17 years old, I still can't believe that. When he was like 2 or 3, my mom, I remember I was at her house and she was babysitting him. And he loved to be outside, and they lived down a very long driveway. It was very long. And so seems really safe because, you're pretty far, but where it led to was a major highway where cars were always like speeding really fast. And anyway, he kind of got loose in the yard. And he always played in the back, but he and she was older. She is older, but even at that time she was older. So she couldn't run after him. And I remember he got away from her basically and ran into the front yard. And she was quite loudly telling him to come back, right? And he thought it was a game. So every time she yelled at him to come back, and she'd go toward him, he'd run further toward the road. And so I went outside, I'm like, come back. And he thought that was funny too. He kept running. So she realized I can't keep doing this because he's going to run into the traffic. And so she pretended she saw a bird, and she was all happy about it, and convinced him through curiosity to come back, right? But when he got back, and this is the only time 17 or 15 years ago that my mother ever used corporal punishment on my nephew, but I remember she spanked him, and she after she spanked him, she looked at him and said, when I tell you to come here, you listen and you come here. And he never went to the front yard again. I'm just saying, he never even tried it again in all his little years. And this is what punishment is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be corrective, right? But why did the punishment in this case fit the crime, right? Because my mother was trying to save him from a terrible fate, right? She knew that he had to learn this lesson and never forget it, right? And it was to keep him safe from literally death, right? And so punishment is supposed to bring us back from death, right? In God's mind, this is why he allows sometimes punishment with quotes, in the form of suffering, right? Maybe some of that suffering is a consequence of my sin, I'm just going my own way. And maybe you've heard the conversion stories. Someone kind of hits bottom in their life, and what do? Well, there's nowhere to turn but up. Right? So then they reach out to God, and they have this major, amazing conversion, our great saints, like Saint Augustine, or I can't think of another one right now, but many, right? Maybe many people that we even know, maybe us, right? We have this, we've been in sin, and then we have this epiphany moment and we suffer because of our sin, we're suffering because of our sins, and we come back to God because of it, right? So in that way, for suffering as punishment to be corrective, a discipline that God allows, is totally valid. And John Paul says, yeah, sometimes God does that. But the reason that God allows that is not because he's some evil man, right? It's because of his mercy. It's his mercy that prompts him. He wants to heal us from maybe something in our lives that we're not listening to God about, right? And so he'll allow us to experience the consequences of what we're choosing, but not in an effort just to be mean or just to get revenge, but in an effort to draw us back to himself and to draw us to healing. Now we're going to use a little case study to talk about this idea of punishment and where things would have been when Jesus would have come on the scene, right? And that we find that in the book of Job. We're not going to like read from Job or anything. I think we're familiar enough with the story not to have to. But in the Old Testament, they did not understand suffering to be corrective or to be out of God's mercy, right? Instead, they viewed a person who is suffering as being outside of God's will, right? That the reason the person was experiencing whatever they were experiencing was because of their personal sin, right? Because they had done something to offend God. This is why Job's friends come to him and they say, Job, just admit what you did so you can just like stop all this pain, And he's like, I did nothing, right? I'm innocent. And so we see here, like, from the lessons we can take from Job, or first of all, I'm sorry, that Job, he always claims his innocence, that he was not a sinner, right? But still God permitted him to suffer. And so there's this part at the beginning of the story where even we see this interaction between God and the Satan figure, right? And so the Satan is like, oh, I see Job, but if you make him suffer, basically, right? I'm paraphrasing. If you make him suffer, then he's going to curse you, and he's not going to be faithful. And so God allows it. God permits Satan to cause horrible things to happen to Job, right? So God does permit suffering sometimes, right? But we also see that God has sovereignty over suffering, right? And this is evident in the story because God limits the power of the Satan. Like he says, okay, fine, you can cause his suffering, but you cannot do anything physical to him, right? So like he loses his fortune, he loses all his children, right? And then Job's still faithful, right? And so Satan comes back and says, well, if you let me harm him physically, then he's going to turn on you, right? So God's like, okay, but don't take his life. And then we know like he breaks out in boils and all this physical suffering, but Job still doesn't curse God, right? So we see here from this, right, that yes, sometimes God does permit us to suffer the consequences of our sin, or he wants to heal us and we have to walk through some suffering to get to the other side, right, to heal. So sometimes he'll allow suffering in kind of like this corrective way, but that's not all, right? Sometimes you're completely innocent and you're suffering, right? It's that discipline or mercy, God's mercy, is not the only reason. This idea of punishment or discipline is not the only reason that people suffer sometimes. Sometimes people are totally innocent, right? And they suffer. And we also learn in Job too, which is interesting in this constant exchange between him and God and the Satan, that God is not abandoning Job in his suffering, right? He's setting those limits and saying, you can push on, this is how far you can go. This is how, right? So God wins the battle, right? He wins the war in the end, even though we might have some wounds going through it. Okay, our next thing that brings us to the next kind of aspect that I like to talk about suffering in, and that's suffering as salvific, right? So like here comes the big drum roll, enter Christ, right? Into this Old Testament perception of suffering, into this cursed state of being, right? In our human nature. Then enters Christ, who takes the most horrible human experience that, by the way, is not going to be reversed. We're not going to suddenly snap back to original man. So we're kind of stuck with these consequences. This is, how we are now. But thank goodness Jesus doesn't love in a way that he abandons us, right? Once he saves us. But he comes in not only in the flesh, right? But he came for a particular purpose. So these next things here on out till the end is going to come directly from John Paul's letter on salvific suffering. But he references in this paragraph John 3:16. And we all know this verse, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, right? And so John Paul really breaks that down. He said, first of all, he says, okay, salvation is that we are set free, right, from evil and sin. So whenever we hear this verse from John 3:16, John Paul really, he like zooms in on that word that God gave his only son, right? And he says this in paragraph 14, the very word gives, and then, in the verse it's actually gave, indicates that this liberation, the liberation from evil and sin, must be achieved by the only begotten son through his own suffering. And in this, love is manifested, the infinite love, both of that only begotten son and of the Father, who for this reason gives his son. This is love for man, love for the world. It is salvific love, right? In other words, to give oneself, right, the way that Christ did, even unto death, suffering and death, right? This is salvific. And this is the element that Christ adds, right, to the experience of suffering. Because Christ came and in his innocence, he willingly undertook his suffering, right, and death and resurrection, that Christ has forever linked, John Paul says, suffering to love. He has brought into it, right, a new meaning. And so Christ enters into what John Paul calls the world of human suffering, right? He takes on all of that, all of our experiences, right, except sin. And he says, John Paul says, even though we can say that Christ's death was like out of justice, because we deserved it, right? We deserved what Christ got because of our sin. And even though it does fulfill God's justice, that's not the most, it is the most amazing thing that he did, but like there's more to the story, right? John Paul always talks in plus signs. He says, yes, this is great, but let me tell you something that's equally as great and as important. And that's what he does in this next part. He says, at the same time, it has entered into a completely new dimension and a new order. Suffering has entered into a completely new dimension and a new order. It has been linked to love. Christ, whenever he came, right, and entered into suffering, he also elevated it, right? John Paul calls it an evolutionary jump in the meaning of suffering. If you think about like the science of evolution, like, you have populations that are evolving and then they'll make what, scientists will call an evolutionary jump, like just this amazing growth that's kind of like hard to imagine, right? In the species developing or developing into another species or, So John Paul calls this link of suffering to love an evolutionary jump in the meaning of suffering. And I'm going to, just for the sake of time, because I don't want to, I think I was supposed to keep this to an hour. I'm going to skip like the dissection of this part about John Paul talking about the lifting up of Christ in suffering, because I have a visual that will get the same message. So John Paul says, when Jesus left the bosom of the Trinity and descended, right, into the human condition. It's not that he just took on our flesh, and I mean, he was the perfect human. He's the reason why we look to him to know ourselves, right? But also, he not only did that, right? He went down into the weakest, most humiliating, most vile part of what it means to be a human person, except for sin, right? He never sinned, but he took into himself every consequence of sin. It's not almost, it is worse to be innocent and take on all of the consequences of people's sin, not just in his generation when he was physically on earth, but for all eternity, right? So he enters down, John Paul says, into the most wretched human experiences through his suffering. But luckily, that is not the end of the story in his plan of saving us, right? Because like Christ entered down into the lowest place in the human condition, he was also raised up on the cross. So he entered into the horrible experience of suffering, and not only in order to redeem it, but to lift it up, to elevate that experience, to bring it up to a new salvific level when he linked it to his salvific love, right? So that brings us to the final aspect, or the final view that it took to talk about suffering. And that is suffering as redemptive, suffering as elevated, as lifted up, right? And so John Paul says in paragraph 19 of his letter, in the cross of Christ, not only is the redemption accomplished through suffering, but also human suffering itself is now redeemed, right? There is something redemptive about human suffering because Christ, in his humanity, entered into that experience with all of himself, right? And so he says in paragraph 19, every man, so every human person, has his own share in the redemption. Each one is also called to share in that suffering through which the redemption was accomplished. In bringing about the redemption through suffering, Christ has also raised human suffering to the level of redemption. In other words, it's the Christ's willingness to suffer is the reason that now our suffering can have redemptive power, right? Thus, each man, John Paul says, in his suffering can also become a sharer in the redemptive suffering of Christ. Now, he says, though we share through our sufferings, we share in the work of redemption when we are willing to suffer for the sake of Christ. Now, all of this so far, if you're like me, this kind of sounds like words, right? It's a lot of words. So I kind of have a picture to say I'm going to get back to all of it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I'm not giving you the climax of this section yet. I'm going to hold off and just know there's more to say. Because we have to also see, I want to do a little bit of how, right? So he turns in paragraph 24 in the letter to this phrase. And if you're a member of the community or you've been around the community for any length of time, you know this passage, right? Now I rejoice in my sufferings for your sake, and in my flesh I complete what is lacking in Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, that is the church. So whenever we hear this, we have to ask the question, was there something lacking in Christ's sufferings, right? Or at least that's the first question that always came to my mind. And so John Paul says, in talking about this verse, he says, well, first of all, whoever suffers in union with Christ, that's the first thing that this passage is talking about, right? We have to have a way to unite our sufferings with Christ. We can't, suffering for suffering's sake is misery, right? But suffering united to Christ is where, to Christ's sufferings is where we can become what John Paul says, we can participate in the creative character of suffering, right? And what did Christ's suffering create? Redemption, right? So we can participate in Christ redeeming others, redeeming the world, if we are willing to be in union with Christ in our own sufferings. So there's nothing lacking, right? Is there anything lacking in Christ's suffering? No, there's not anything lacking in the sufferings that Christ endured, right? What's really lacking, right, is my suffering. Christ has prepared it in a way that he has entered into this experience, decided to use it to save humanity. And then he left a door open for each individual person. And he said, each person who suffers, I'm inviting to participate in redeeming humanity. What's missing in Christ's sufferings, the way the thing is phrased, right, is my suffering, my willingness to unite my suffering to Christ's sufferings. So when I unite it with love to his sufferings, then my suffering is elevated and it's given new meaning. Because by doing this, it is a participation in the redemption that is currently being applied to the members of Christ, to the members of his body, right? So in the same way that the church, even though Jesus has completely saved us and completely redeemed us, that salvation and redemption has to be applied to each individual in all of time. How does the church bring this to individuals? Through the sacraments, right? The church makes present what was done by Christ in time and his loving sacrifice of himself that is ongoing in eternity forever. The church makes it present to us through the sacraments. This is how the church completes Jesus's redemptive work on earth. John Paul here is saying that in this same way, if I'm willing to embrace my sufferings and unite them to the sufferings of Christ, I can have a share in completing Christ's work of redemption in the church. I can participate with him in the application of the redemption of others here, now, in time. So as disciples of Christ, right, suffering for Christ, some words of encouragement is the, I like to call this next part. Oh, and by the way, that was like the big reveal. I had to say, right, I couldn't just say that at the beginning. I want to say that toward this part, because we are the ones who are called, right, to walk through the door of our own suffering, to participate in the redemption of humanity. Okay, some encouragement for those of us who suffer. We all need it. John Paul says later in the letter, paragraph 25, that at the same time that we have this call to embrace our sufferings, uniting them to Christ, right? At the same time, Christ will provide every grace that we need to endure suffering for his sake, right? Sometimes it gets bleak, right? Especially in long suffering, you know? So like maybe someone's left the church, a child or something like that, or maybe a chronic illness, right? When the suffering is long, John Paul reassures his audience, right, that Christ is there. When I'm united to him in my suffering, he has not abandoned me. He's going to provide every grace I need to endure that suffering for his sake, right? And that those who suffer, he calls it, it's so beautiful, he calls it the human suffering, the fact that I experienced that is proof of the person's likeness to Christ, right? The proof of my likeness to Christ, right, is my suffering, right? Suffering identifies us, John Paul says, with Christ, and can also unite us to him. And through suffering comes victory over the world. And he also wants to talk about the resurrection. He says the resurrection is another encouragement to us, because on the other side of that suffering, on the other side of that cross, that death, right, is the resurrection, right? When the first person who arrived at the resurrection went into the tomb, Mary Magdalene, right? What did she see? She saw two angels, like heaven was in the tomb, right? So whenever we have to remember also, right, that our sufferings, when united to Christ, even if we don't see the effects, it is redemptive, it's redeeming, right, for the members of the church. And so the next encouraging thing that I want to take from the letter and share tonight is Mary's role. And John Paul calls her the icon of the church, right? And he says this about her participation. He says, as a witness to her son's passion by her presence, and as a sharer in it by her compassion, Mary offered a unique contribution to the gospel of suffering. She embodies in anticipation St. Paul's words about completing in her flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Because St. Paul hadn't spoken those words yet at the cross, right? But she embodies in anticipation St. Paul's words about completing in her flesh what is lacking in the sufferings of Christ. And we have to remember that the Blessed Mother is looked at as the icon of the church. So as she stood at the cross of her son, right? And Paul says Mary is participating in this redeeming act through her own suffering, and she's embodying the vocation of all of us who are in the church and are called to participate in the redeeming action of Christ on the cross. She's embodying us all. So uniting our sufferings even to her is also a way to assist Christ, right, in his work of redemption. And then John Paul wants to talk a little bit about joy and suffering. He says, only when we become willing to embrace our sufferings and unite them to the sufferings of Christ, then we can experience interior peace and even spiritual joy, even though we are suffering. And then last but not least, let me see. Yeah, exactly an hour. I'm doing so good. Okay. All right. So in our bodies, this is what I'll leave us to think about for the rest of the week. This is how we're going to make up. This is how we're going to participate. This is how we are going to participate in the redemption of others, right? But how do I actually, what are my practicals? Like, what do I actually do? The biggest one, I think, is in disposition, right? And if I think about it, I have a little analogy for this. Like, have you ever noticed that whenever you're around a person a lot, that you start to like take on their mannerisms, and maybe you use like some phrasing that only they use, but then like you find yourself like you'll even say stuff and you'll be like, that sounds just like so and so. Like you realize that you're acting like them, right? You're taking on their habits. You're taking on sometimes even maybe their way of seeing things, right? The same thing happens to us, or should be hopefully happening to us through our prayer, through the sacraments, through adoration, through mass, right? That as I'm having these encounters with Christ, because I'm in a relationship with him, right? That I am taking on and into myself his way of seeing, his way of responding, his way of phrasing things, his way of receiving things, right? That's a disposition. To participate in another's disposition means that I take on into my own flesh their characteristics, both their, right? And in this case, we're talking about like a characteristic of the heart, right? So an openness and willingness to embrace, a willingness to stand at the cross, or sometimes even to be nailed to it. So I can, forming that in my disposition means that I take on his responses to my own crosses, my own sufferings. So to reflect, I thought it would be good to consider our dispositions in light of the two who did it the best, right? Mary's 7 sorrows. What are my 7 sorrows? Maybe you have less than 7, that would be awesome. But most people have more than 1. But what are my sorrows? What am I being asked in my circumstances right now, in my life as it is right now? What am I being asked to embrace? And how do I know I'm being asked to embrace it? If it's happening, you're being asked to embrace it. That's just how it works, right? God allows our circumstances to reveal, right, what he wants us to embrace. So what are my sorrows? And then in those sorrows, in those sufferings, what are my words from my cross, right? Jesus had set his 7 last words from the cross. Well, whenever I'm suffering, what are my words? Do they look like Jesus's? Do they sound like Jesus's? Do they have the heart that Jesus had whenever he said, Father, forgive them. Today you'll be with me in paradise. I thirst, right? Is that what my heart says whenever I encounter these sorrows? Or do they fail? Do they fail to align to his heart? So I hope that this can serve as a good examination for us, especially as we continue to move through the week.